Hey there, my name is Alexis and I'm going to show you how I made this Christmas tree out of red oak plywood. So the reason I decided to make this in the first place was about 3 years ago we got a new cat and she had the tendency to climb the tree a lot, so she broke a bunch of the branches and we eventually had to throw out the tree. So the following year I decided to make a Christmas tree out of plywood and a piano hinge, and it worked really well, but there were a few things I wanted to change, so this year I decided to remake it. So the first thing I wanted to change was the type of plywood I'm using. The first time I used Baltic birch, this time I'm using red oak. I've been using red oak for most of my projects now and I really like the grain pattern it gives. So to cut the plywood itself, I use a circular saw and a straight edge. And I made this spacer block piece to help me make a more accurate cut because my eyesight's kind of bad when it comes to this and I end up sometimes being, a 1/16 of an inch or so off. So I start off by cutting an angle at both ends of the plywood sheet that I'm using, and those sides will act as the bottoms of the tree itself. And the reason I cut the ends at an angle is so that the tree can lean back once it's put together. The first one was vertical and it leaves a big gap behind the tree itself, and by having it lean back it allows it to stay closer to the wall and leave as little space between the tree and the wall as possible. It also helps give the tree a more cone shape like a conventional tree does. And the kind of shape you're going for in regards to the whole plywood sheet is a parallelogram, where you're cutting 3 inches from one corner and then cutting 3 inches from the other corner diagonal from that corner you just cut. Although you can cut more off or less off depending on how close to the wall you want your tree to be. So once you cut the ends off from the plywood, you're going to cut diagonally down the length of the plywood so that you're cutting the sides for the actual Christmas tree itself. So when I actually made this cut, I cut it down the wrong corners. So here's a quick diagram of how I did this cut. So here at the ends are where you do your first cuts. And this is the cut that I accidentally made, but the actual way I should have been cutting it was diagonally down these corners. So after I made this cut and then contemplating on what options I have, I decided to re-glue those pieces that I cut initially. And the wood glue I use is Type Bond 3. It's waterproof and it's the only wood glue I use for all my projects, although you can use different ones. And the wood glue should cure for the most part in about a half hour or so. So in the meantime, while the wood glue cures, I made some oak edge banding out of some oak board I picked up from my local home center. And even though I use a table saw to make this, there are different types of edge banding you can use that doesn't require any power tools. And I'm actually going to use that type for a different part of the tree build later on. And you only need an iron to apply it. Once the glue had cured on the plywood pieces, I came back with the circular saw and cut the ends in the proper direction. Now that the plywood pieces are cut to their final shape, I can apply the edge banding on the sides. So to apply the edge banding that I made, I just used wood glue, some tape, and some clamps, and leave it alone for about an hour or so. And you don't need to put on edge banding for these types of builds. You could leave the edges exposed, but putting on edge banding adds quality to the build. It gives it a more solid wood look. And this was my first time making my own edge banding using solid wood versus the iron-on version, and I do like this option better. It takes a tiny bit longer, but I think it's worth the extra quality you get from it. So the oak board that I used to make the edge banding is 3/4 of an inch thick. The red oak plywood though is slightly under, so there's going to be a bit of excess sticking out from either side of the plywood. So to remove the excess, you have a few options. You could use a chisel, a palm router with a flush trim bit if you have one. What I did is I picked up a pack of utility blades for $1. And I used painter's tape to cover the side that's going to be in contact with the plywood, and then I just did slow passes over the edge until the edge banding was close to flush with the plywood, and then I just sand the rest of it off with 120 grit sandpaper. If you're unable to or don't want to make your own edge banding, you can pick up a roll of edge banding yourself. It's very thin and it has an adhesive on one side, and when you apply a hot iron to it, the adhesive melts and bonds to whatever surface it's on. And it bonds really quickly, so make sure you have your edge banding properly aligned. But typically edge banding tends to be about 1/8 of an inch or so wider than the thickness of the plywood it's meant for, so there is some room for error. So before I install the remaining iron-on edge banding, I'm going to remove the excess edge banding that I made using a Japanese pole saw so I can wrap around the iron-on edge banding over the edge banding that I made. Although it's not really necessary, I just thought it would be a good idea. When you want to wrap around a corner without entirely removing it, I just do a few light passes along the edge banding until I'm able to bend it, and then I just apply a bit of heat to it and then continue wrapping it around until you're done. After you install the remaining edge banding, I remove the excess using a utility blade, and I just make really light passes along the inside of the edge banding until I make a score line, and then I just keep passing along that score line until it ultimately snaps, or you can even put a bit of force on it and it should snap off pretty easily. And any edges that are still rough, I clean up with 220 grit sandpaper. And I do one more pass with the iron just to make sure the utility blade didn't push the edge banding off of the plywood edge. Now all that's left is to clean up the surface and make sure there's no glue residue from before, because when you stain it, the stain's not going to penetrate the wood underneath that glue. So make sure you hit that area up with 120 grit sandpaper and do a few hard passes if it doesn't come off right away, and it should come off relatively quick. Lastly is to make the holes for where you install the lights. The placement of the lights, I guess, is entirely on you. You may want to space it out based on the height of your plywood piece. For example, mine is about 60 inches tall, so I spaced out my holes every 6 inches vertically, and then horizontally I had the hole that's closest to the outer edge be about 2 inches away, and then the hole that's closest to the inner edge, or I guess the edge that's going to be the center line of the tree, about 1 inch, so that when they're put together, those holes closest to that inner center line is closer together and looks a lot more uniform. And then anything between those two outer holes, I just space it out evenly, about 2 inches to 3 inches apart. Another factor you should consider is how far apart your lights can be spaced out, because they have a set length. I think they're about 3 inches or so keep that in mind as well. In terms of the hole diameter, it depends on your specific lights. So for the face of the tree, I'm making slightly bigger holes than the diameter of the light bulb itself. And then on the back side, I'm actually drilling a hole almost all the way through that's about the same diameter as the body of the light. And to achieve this, I would recommend using a stop collar, which basically stops the drill bit from going past a certain depth that you've set it. And I would practice on some scrap pieces before doing this, because you don't want to make a mistake on this, as well as make sure the drill bit that you're using isn't too aggressive. So this drill bit is actually a little more aggressive than I would like, and it actually tore a bit of the plywood on the backside, but since it's on the backside, it's okay, as no one's gonna really see that side. A tip that I would give is, if you want to minimize tear out, I would clamp a sacrificial piece of wood on the side of the plywood that you don't want to get torn up, so that when it drills through that side of the plywood, the sacrificial piece is going to protect the surrounding plywood from getting torn up like it normally would if it wasn't protected. Once I was done making the holes, I sanded everything down using 220 grit sandpaper, made sure there was no rough edges, no splinter areas caused by the holes, and then I could proceed to staining the workpiece. And the stain that I used was by Minwax. It's a water-based wiping stain, and it's emerald green, so it's closer to a Christmas tree kind of green. And after a couple hours of the first coat, I gave it a second coat just so I could give it a deeper color, just so I can aim for a darker tone of green. And in combination with the grain pattern and the light shaded green, it kind of looked more like a watermelon than a Christmas tree, so that's also why I wanted to go with a deeper shade of green. Once the stain finally cured, I apply a few coats of water-based poly, and I like using water-based poly because usually it dries within like 20-30 minutes, so you can add a second coat almost immediately after that. And I could reuse the brush. I just gotta rinse it down, let it dry before I apply a new coat. And because it's water-based, I would wait until the second coat to sand in between the coats if you need to. Sometimes you don't have to sand, but just wait until after the second coat to sand it, just so you don't take off too much poly. And I would do really light hand sanding. I wouldn't put too much pressure on the sandpaper. You shouldn't have to put a lot of pressure if you've sanded the workpiece well enough beforehand. Now all that's left is to install the piano hinge. And I always pre-drill my holes before I install my screws because you never know what type of material you might be using sometimes, and you don't want to risk splitting your wood just because you didn't feel like pre-drilling your holes. So I would always recommend pre-drilling your holes whenever you're using screws. And when using a power drill for small screws like these, I would always drill almost all the way through, and then I would finish it up with a screwdriver, because if you use a power drill all the way, you might risk breaking the screw if you do. And now you're finally done. All that's left is to decorate your tree.